here was abbreviated, and we're very happy that we were able to get Bob back at the very next Madison Forum meeting. He is an outstanding American, outstanding Georgian, and we miss his presence in Congress. He's a voice that was heard, he had an effect, and he represented the people well, and he wasn't afraid to speak out. He was a former U.S. attorney here in Georgia who prosecuted the bad guys, and he had to have police protection. So he's not fearful in any way, and we need more people now. Bob, and I wish that he would run for office. I would stay for Senate, not putting pressure on you, Bob. Nevertheless, we miss his kind and style of leadership, and it's needed. So anyway, Bob, thank you very much for coming.
Glad to, Michael. Thank you.
And by the way, Bob is a Madison Forum Member.
And I wore my Federalist tie today, which has Madison on it. One of my favorites. Michael mentioned one little thing that I'd like to touch on. Has nothing to do with the subject matter that we're going to talk about today, which is Second Amendment. But he mentioned that I had security when I was U.S. Attorney. It was actually on one occasion. I served for about 4 years, and we handled a wide range of cases, a number of public corruption cases. Some of you may remember a lot of drug cases, a lot of white-collar crime cases, some involving some very nasty characters out of the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. We had an uprising out there back in the late 1980s while I was U.S. Attorney, and some of the goings on, I don't know if you all remember, but they burned a couple of buildings and so forth. Anyway, we had a wide range of cases as the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia, and the only time that I needed or felt the need for protection was one year we extradited to the Northern District of Georgia a Colombian cartel, a top Colombian cartel, Medellin cartel, money laundering official. And we had some intelligence information that they didn't like that, and they might decide to take action against the U.S. Attorney's Office. So, in light of that, I thought, well, maybe we ought to talk with the U.S. Marshals and have protection for a little while until this case is over. So I went to the U.S. Attorney's Office. At the time was on the 18th floor of the Federal Building downtown, and the U.S. Marshal's Office was, I think it was a couple of floors below that. So I'd go down to the U.S. Marshal's Office and explain to them that we had some intelligence information that was pretty solid about some folks in the cartel that were upset with us extraditing one of their top money launderers to the district for prosecution, and we'd like to have some protection for that period of time. They gave me a stack of forms to fill out. They said, fill these forms out and we'll send them to Washington, and we'll let you know what Washington decides. I didn't bother. What I did, though, is I called up a good friend of mine, who at the time, Bob Hightower, was the public safety director for Cobb County, where we lived. And I explained the situation to Bob, and he says, don't worry about it, we'll have people out there. And that evening, and for the duration of this period of time, they had protection for it. Didn't have to fill out any forms. It just illustrates the difference between working with your elected, with your local officials. Bob Hightower was not an elected official, but he was answerable to people. He was approachable. The difference between that and dealing with the bureaucracy that is the federal government, whether it is something in the nature of an emergency or simply a routine matter, they live and die by forms. And it's really a shame that the federal government has gotten that way, but it has, as we all know, those of us, whether it's in dealing with military matters or transportation matters matters or many of the matters that I had the opportunity to deal with while I served as U.S. Attorney. But after the meeting last week, in which I was so late because of getting wrong directions, and it was all entirely my fault. I can't blame it on anybody else in my office or anywhere else. I told Michael, I said, at the next opportunity, please let Jennifer in my office know when would be the next opportunity to speak again with the group so that we can talk in a little more depth about issues regarding the Second Amendment. And it's actually very timely because, well, the Second Amendment issues are always timely because it is always under attack by the left, whether it is directly or indirectly. They always are after the Second Amendment because they recognize, as much as we do, how important the right to keep and bear arms is as a fundamental privilege or immunity of citizenship. It's actually a basic human right, but it is a privilege or immunity to be protected against limitations by state governments, in addition to the federal government, by virtue of the 14th Amendment. And the left realizes that. They recognize that an armed citizenry, a citizenry that has the right to and has access to firearms, is far different from a disarmed citizenry in terms of the government's ability to control whether it is during a crisis or any other time. And therefore, the left never sleeps when it comes to the Second Amendment, and that's why we have to be constantly cognizant of Second Amendment issues and watch for ways that the left chips away at it, because they are very adept at doing it through judicial decisions, through judicial appointments, as well as through local elected officials, as well as through local unelected officials and state officials at all levels of government, and elected or appointed. If liberals get in, that is something that we can take to the bank, and that is that sooner or later, both they will move against the Second Amendment and try and place limitations on it. One case that I think I did mention, Michael, you can correct me if I didn't, but I think I mentioned a case that at the time, several weeks ago, was on the agenda for the U.S. Supreme Court to decide. And it was a case, I believe it was called Caniglia, a case, something like that, out of, it was either Rhode Island or Connecticut, one of the states up there in the northeast part of their country, the leftist country of the northeast United States. And the case, since I mentioned it, that it was on the docket for the Supreme Court to take up, they did take it up. You might have seen this just a couple of weeks ago, and rendering a 9-0 decision, rendered a good decision. That doesn't happen very often. One that we get a good decision on the Second Amendment. Well, first of all, it doesn't happen very often that the Supreme Court takes a good Second Amendment case or a solid Second Amendment case. It's even less rare that they render a good decision on it, and it's even less rare that they render a unanimous decision. But they did in this case, and part of the reason I think they did in this case is because the case brought together not just Second Amendment issues, the right to keep and bear arms and limitations thereon, but also the Fourth Amendment, which protects us against unreasonable searches and seizures. Now keep in mind, well, we all understand this, but a lot of people don't. Whether or not a search and seizure by the government is conducted pursuant to a warrant or without a warrant, all searches and seizures have to be reasonable. That is, if the government is going to invade your person, your home, your papers, your things, they have to have a reason for doing it, and it has to be a reasonable basis. If, in fact, they go to the judge to secure a warrant, it is up to that judge to make sure that the basis on which the law enforcement officials are seeking the warrant is reasonable. If the government does not go before a judge to secure a warrant, then the basis on which they engage in that search and seizure still has to be reasonable. It doesn't require that every search and seizure be accomplished, be carried out according to a warrant, but it does require that all of them have to be reasonable. And there are exceptions to the warrant requirement, some of which we're certainly aware of. One is consent. If you are stopped in your car or the police come to your house and ask you as the owner of the house or the person with apparent authority over the house or the car, and they say, can we search it, and you consent, then you have consented to a search, and it may not be reasonable, but if you consent to it, that's an exception to the standard, the reasonableness standard, the warrant exception, the warrant requirement. There are some other exceptions, exigent circumstances. If in fact the police are engaged in a law enforcement operation and they need to seize something or search something, and they do so because in their mind, and there has to be an objective standard, they are facing an emergency such that people would be harmed if they didn't act quickly. They didn't have time to go before a judge and secure a warrant. Very easy nowadays to get a warrant because you can use the smartphone, you can use telephone. Judges are available in virtually every district across the country, certainly in every federal district. They are available 24/7, so there's really never a reason, so long as there is time to secure a warrant, for police to secure a warrant. But sometimes they don't, and exigent circumstances, an emergency, for example, or consent, for example, destruction of evidence, they can in fact proceed. Well, what happened in this case up in the Northeast is they didn't create an exception, but they came up with one that, to be honest with you, I'd never even heard of before. The circumstances were this, and it points out just how clever, how insidiously clever the government can be when they want to do something quickly to limit Second Amendment. There was a couple at their home, and they were elderly. I don't remember how old. Elderly could be my age, or it could be Michael's age. I don't know, but there was an elderly couple, and they were having an argument. No real surprise. They were having an argument, and the husband got exasperated and he had a handgun in the house, and he banged the handgun on the table and said, "Take this, put me out of my misery. I can't take this anymore." He didn't use it. He banged it down. He was fed up with whatever the argument was about and so forth. And at some point then the wife decides, I'm worried about this, so I'm going to call the police. And he calls the police, says, I'm worried about my husband. I think he poses a danger to himself or other people because of the way he's behaving. There's a discussion, and depending on which side of the evidence you look at, the husband either agreed to go get a quick psychiatric evaluation, or the police tell him to. Anyway, he leaves, goes and gets a psychiatric evaluation. Turns out he doesn't pose a danger to anybody. They just had an argument and that's it. In the meantime, though, the police go into the house. Apparently the wife gives them permission. Again, these are all factual issues. Bottom line is they go into the house, they take his handgun, apparently it was the only one that he had, take the ammunition, and leave, impound it. Husband comes back, he's not happy with this. So he goes to the police and asks to have his handgun and ammunition returned, and they refuse. Now eventually, they do return it to him, but it took quite a bit of time. I don't remember how long, but weeks, I think, before he could get his firearm back. Well, this case presents a couple of issues that were very interesting to the Supreme Court, and should be to all of us. The law enforcement, the local police had plenty of time to go get a warrant. There was never a dispute about that. There were no exigent circumstances. The husband wasn't even there, and there was no emergency. And there was no consent. The husband did not consent to having them come in and take his firearm. So you had this very interesting case that brought together Second Amendment issues about seizure and holding of a lawfully owned firearm by a law-abiding citizen. He hadn't violated any laws. And whether or not and to what extent the police can come into a home, search and seize something, in this case a firearm and ammunition. So I think it was that sort of that confluence or that joinder of both Fourth Amendment and Second Amendment issues that gave rise to a 9-0 decision that held what the police were doing under this community risk or whatever they call it exception was bogus. There was no exception, the search was unreasonable, and there was no reason for them not to have tried to secure a warrant. Whether or not they could have gotten a warrant, we don't know, but they didn't even try. So every once in a while, the Supreme Court does get it right, even on Second Amendment issues, which Justice Thomas has complained for years. This is sort of, what do they say, the redheaded stepchild or whatnot of constitutional issues that the Supreme Court, by and large, just doesn't want to take up. You know, you bring an abortion issue to them, they trip over themselves. The Russians usually decide it, almost always adverse to the right to life. You bring them a First Amendment issue, and they love to take these on. But bring them a Second Amendment issue, and they sort of shy away from it. So we have not had, for 13 years, a definitive, clear Second Amendment ruling from the Supreme Court. This most recent one was not so much a Second Amendment case as it was a Fourth Amendment case, even though it was good for the Second Amendment. So, in 2008, as you all recall, we had the Keller decision out of the District of Columbia, which for the very first time since the Bill of Rights was adopted, in which the Supreme Court held by a good 5-4 majority, that the Second Amendment does exactly what it says and was clearly intended to do, and that is to protect against government intrusion the right to keep and bear arms as an individual right. Unfortunately, in cobbling together that 5-vote majority, which was offered by Justice Scalia, they could not extend it beyond simply the home place, the facts of the case. Mr. Keller, the facts of the case were that in the District of Columbia, he was prevented from having an operable firearm in his home. So even though the decision was a good one, because it said once and for all to the liberals, the Second Amendment means what it says and was intended. It protects an individual right to keep and bear arms. But it did not extend outside the home place. 2 years later, in 2010, a case out of Chicago, Illinois, the Supreme Court extended the Keller decision to all the 50 states, not just D.C. So, in the intervening 13 years since Keller, the right to carry a firearm outside one's home has not been presented clearly to the court, and the court has not taken a case to decide that. They now have. There's a case out of New York, the New York Rifle and Pistol Club case. There was a different case involving the New York Rifle and Pistol Club a year ago, but this one is even more important because it presents squarely the question of whether or not that right guaranteed by Keller extends outside the home place. So the Supreme Court has decided to take that case and will render a decision probably late next spring on that. And it will give us an opportunity to see exactly where Trump's 3 appointees to the court, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Coney Barrett, stand on Second Amendment issues. Because this is not a case like the Peniglia case that is primarily a Fourth Amendment case or another amendment case. It is foursquare, front and center, a Second Amendment case. And does the right to keep and bear arms as an individual right extend beyond the home place. Now, common sense tells you, of course it does. If you have the right to keep and bear arms, if you have the right to protect yourself by use of a firearm, then it clearly means outside the home place, because it's outside the home place where most circumstances present themselves where you need to defend yourself. Yes, it happens in the home place, certainly, but particularly if you live, as people do in D.C., in neighborhoods in Chicago, Detroit, Atlanta, it's once you step outside that, in many instances, the danger is really heightened. So that's when you need that right, and it should not be arbitrarily taken away by government. So that's a case out of New York. There are other nuances of Second Amendment cases that we need to be aware of that haven't presented themselves yet to the court. And one important series of cases are those in states like North Carolina in particular, which of course used to be a very strong conservative, Republican, pro-Second Amendment state. It's changed dramatically in recent years, as many other states have. And now in North Carolina, you have to go to the local sheriff in order to get his or her permission to get a pistol permit, to buy a pistol. And what happens when you give the government, as we know, but a lot of people don't, when you give a government official that power as a gatekeeper to exercise a right, then you present a real problem. No local official should have the arbitrary power to decide whether or not you decide to exercise a constitutionally guaranteed right, be it the Second Amendment, or traveling from one state to another, or getting on an airplane, which, by the way, was declared back decades ago, in I think the 1950s, not 1960s, to be a fundamental right to interstate travel. And yet, where are we today? Today, we are at the situation where unelected law enforcement officials, the TSA, can prevent you from, arbitrarily, from boarding an aircraft to exercise a fundamental constitutionally guaranteed right. Yet, because people have become, particularly since 9/11, scared of their own shadow, and that's been reflected in government power, these bureaucrats have taken these powers and are more than willing to exercise them. And what's happened in North Carolina, for example, and some other states as well, is these local sheriffs, some of them are slow walking the applications, so that I have a friend that lives up in North Carolina, and he's had to wait over a year in order to get a pistol permit, just to purchase a pistol. And that's not unusual. There are thousands in Mecklenburg County, for example, thousands of applications that have backed up. This is the danger at the federal level. There are two pieces of legislation pending in the Senate. They passed the House, H.R. 8, I think it is, and H.R. 1446. Together, I think it's H.R. 8, if I'm not mistaken. H.R. 8 is the so-called universal background check, which is bad. The insidious one, though, is H.R. 1446, because what H.R. 1446 does is it simply purports to extend from 3 to 10 days the time period according to which the FBI, which administers the National Instant Check System, or NICS, it extends that time period, which currently is limited to 3 days. And Congress wisely, when the NICS system was passed and put into law, they recognized that if in fact there is not a statutory limitation on how long the FBI can take to approve a firearm sale through an FFL, through a federal firearms licensee, then we run the risk of having those government officials slow walk the process so that they delay the right to exercise a constitutional right beyond the time in which your life might be in danger, for example. So Congress mandated that if in fact that request for a firearms purchase, transfer they call it, goes to the FBI through NICS, if within 3 business days, within 3 days, the government cannot give the approval back to the Federums, the FFL, then the FFL, the retailer, Van Doors down in Smyrna or whoever it is, they don't have to, but then they can allow the sale to go forward. So 3 days. This bill, H.R. 1446, says, well, you know, what's wrong with just extending that to 10 days? So on the surface, they make an argument, oh, that's all we're doing. We're just extending it 10 days to give the government because there are so many applications and blah, blah, blah. Well, a lot can happen because if you read the actual language of this bill, H.R. 1446, it doesn't just extend it 10 days. It extends it, you know, given the fact that there might be holidays in there, there might be weekends in there, it extends it to at least a month, if not more. And then the person has to reapply. So it really can be indefinite in many circumstances. Thankfully, at least so far, neither H.R. 8 for the universal background check, which is sort of the holy grail for the gun control folks, and 1446 do not look like they're going anywhere in the Senate. But that could all change very easily if Joe Manchin, for example, is persuaded somehow to support them, or Kristen Sinema in Arizona persuaded otherwise. You know, really hangs on a very thin cord there. But so we have to watch these court appointees, these court cases, which is why probably beyond any reasonable doubt, the very best thing that Trump did during his 4 years was get judiciary appointees who understand and will support the Constitution, and in particular the Second Amendment, and in particular those three. But it's very interesting to see how those three appointees vote. Amy Coney Barrett was on the Court of Appeals for the circuit she was on, I forget the one in the Midwest, I think it was, only for a short period of time. So we don't have a clear feel for her decisions on Second Amendment, but she did issue a very strong defense of the Second Amendment in a dissent on a case just a couple years ago. Justice Kavanaugh, to me, that's going to be the real question mark. I think she's good on Second Amendment. In a case, that different New York Rifle and Pistol Club case last year that the court decided not to take because they said it was moot, he had urged the court to take it anyway to establish, a clear precedent for that case. So he should be okay. Gorsuch, we don't know. He's a strong constitutional scholar, a strong constitutionalist, but we don't yet know, at least I haven't seen anything that gives a real clear indication of where he would stand on a controversial Second Amendment case. Second Amendment cases shouldn't be controversial, of course, but they are. And the court has been very hesitant to take these cases. So, when we look at all this, I think it emphasizes the point that we as conservatives have to be very mindful of all of the different ways that the left can come at the Second Amendment, whether it's through local officials, whether it is through these emergency protective orders or red flag laws. Every time one of these laws is passed, such as giving permitting power to the local sheriff, or giving power to a judge to issue a warrant to seize an individual's firearms without a full hearing, simply because somebody says, oh, it's an emergency. Every time one of these laws is passed by state or local government, it empowers local officials. And if we have the wrong local officials in office that decide those issues or use those powers, it can be very devastating to the Second Amendment. And this is particularly important since over the last really 3 election cycles, maybe, we've seen a lot of what we call George Soros babies get elected, not either elected or appointed. George Soros, very smart man, and very rich man, and very liberal, very much against guns, except of course for his own bodyguards. But what he has done, Bloomberg is doing the same thing, but George Soros really sort of trademarked this, not focusing so much on top-level positions, presidential races or Senate or even members of Congress. What they've been focusing on in recent years is sort of those positions that a lot of people don't pay attention to. Attorneys General, state attorneys general, local district attorneys, sheriffs, and even judicial races. So what they're doing is they recognize that if we, the left, can get people who are opposed to the Second Amendment into local positions, that will work its way up. So you have in New York, for example, where the NRA is engaged in a multi-year battle with the Attorney General in New York, you have one of Soros' babies up there. You have a very liberal, very anti-gun, very anti-NRA Attorney General using the powers of her office to destroy the NRA, and also to reimagine policing in New York by reducing the power that local police have under circumstances under which they can use force, which is another one of the idiotic things that is going on, this reimagining police. It doesn't take long to reimagine a society without police. It's called chaos. And if you don't have a degree of necessary law and order, as our founders recognized, then you can't have freedom. On the one hand, people might say, well, that's a contradiction. And libertarians may disagree. But you need to have a certain degree of law and order. You need to have a certain minimum of laws in a society to protect the right to contract and the right to keep and bear arms. You need laws that establish limitations against what government would like to do in order to have an operable free society where you have the right to contract, the right to go to court to enforce contracts and so forth. So the assaults on the Second Amendment are tremendous, and what the left is doing by passing these laws and empowering local officials, for example, to act as roadblocks to exercising the Second Amendment by individuals, is they are driving a wedge between conservatives and law enforcement. And we see that now in a lot of areas, because some of these local sheriffs are empowered to deny a permit to purchase a handgun, and if they happen to be of a mind that they don't like guns, or they just like power, and they lure that over people, they can in fact prevent people from exercising that right. And that drives a wedge. It presents discord between conservatives and law enforcement, which isn't good. But there's a lot of different aspects of that, Mike. I don't want to take too much time today, but if we could, you might have a question, or if somebody else has a question.